Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the George Collection. I'm Rachel, Right Side Blonde. Today marks episode 48, and I'm going to bring you a cover I haven't brought you yet, which is January of 1997 with Claudia Schiffer on the cover. This is one of those months where there were two different covers, and this is one of those that I'm still missing. So if anyone knows where the darker Claudia Schiffer cover is, where she's crying, I still need that cover. There's two left that I need. So everyone be on the lookout for me. Matt Berman is the original cover artist for the original George, and he wrote a book called JFK Jr., George, and Me. What I find really cool about this cover is that you can see Matt's original sketches for this cover in his book. So I thought that was really awesome to be able to see it on paper and then see it come to life on this cover of George. Today's episode is going to highlight an article by John Kennedy. It was an interview between him and Cokie Roberts, who was chosen as the hottest TV talking head. And there's a lot of interesting responses in this article that I wanted to share with you. So here we go. The title is Cokie Is It? John Kennedy talks to the woman picked by George readers as favorite talking head, Cokie Roberts. The ABC News correspondent and one-time Capitol Hill brat is ready to rule Sunday morning punditry. The first thing you notice about Cokie Roberts in real life is her eyes. Great gray-blue orbs that seem like an evolutionary adaptation allowing her to see more acutely than the rest of us. If you watch television or listen to the radio, it's hard to miss this woman, Cokie, who's been known by the sporty nickname since the days when her toddler brother mangled the name her parents had picked for her, Kareem. Now a 53-year-old mother of two grown children, she is an ABC News correspondent covering politics, Congress, and public policy, as well as a news analyst for National Public Radio, where she has served as congressional correspondent for more than a decade. A frequent substitute anchor on Nightline, Roberts had one particularly memorable joust with Ross Perot in 1982, after which he publicly complained that female journalists were always trying to prove their manhood. Since David Brinkley stepped down from This Week last November, Roberts has shared host duties with Sam Donaldson on the ABC Public Affairs program. Her command of her field is the product of both hard work and bred-in-the-bones intuition, for she was quite literally reared in the halls of Congress. Her father, Hale Boggs, was a congressman from New Orleans, eventually rising to the position of House Majority Leader during an illustrious 27-year career on the Hill. According to those who worked with him, many of whom were in my father's administration, Boggs knew the protocols, rituals, and rights of Congress like no one else, from the labyrinth network of hideaways in the Capitol, where members could slip off for a nip in the afternoon, to the maze of pressure points in the psyches of allies and opponents alike. If you wanted grandiloquent speech-making, you went somewhere else. If you wanted the votes, you went to Boggs. In 1972, while he was on a campaign gig for a freshman congressman, Boggs' plane disappeared over Alaska. Despite one of the largest search and rescue efforts ever mounted within the United States, neither the plane nor any bodies were ever recovered. That didn't stop his constituents from re-electing him the next month in absentia. His vacant seat would eventually be filled by the woman who had run his campaigns and his home office and had performed the buttonholing when it required a soft touch, his wife, Lindy. She went on to a distinguished 17-year career in the House. The Boggs children stayed in the family business. Perhaps growing up in a family in which both parents lived the fractured public lives of politicians made Cokie decide to observe rather than serve. Perhaps it was the realization that she could be more effective as a wry, coolly assured commentator than she could as a legislator. Or, perhaps as her less telegenic rivals might suggest, it was the money. But whatever the reason, her producers, her audience, and the readers of George, who voted her favorite talking head, are glad she signed up with the Fourth Estate. Amid the often prosaic business of government, she keeps politics interesting. John Kennedy asks, you had two parents in Congress and you practically grew up in the Capitol building. How has that affected the way you cover politics? Cokie says, I feel more sympathetic to politicians. I don't assume going in that they're a bunch of crooks and scoundrels. Even my colleagues who don't necessarily make that assumption do assume that every single decision a politician makes is for political motives. I believe they're public servants who work hard to do the right thing for the country, with some exceptions. John said, one thing that was a shock to me growing up was learning that most people have a rather uncharitable view of politicians. Why do you think that is? Cokie responds, well, I do think some of it is our history. You know, get away from the king, have as little government as possible. Americans just mistrust government and anybody who's in it. John says, and it's one thing everyone can agree on. Cokie says, right. Part of it is that it's fun to beat up on politicians. It's easy, you know. They give you plenty of fodder. Vietnam and Watergate increased the distrust, particularly among the press. Because of that, the press has really spread a poisonous attitude about government. John says, when our fathers first ran for office, government was the center of the action. After the last election, is that still true? And Cokie says, yes, it is, but I do think the times are different. I thought a lot about that after this last election because the dynamic of it was so weird. The majority of people came out of the polls saying that they didn't trust the president. I think that some of it is because the Cold War is over. There was a sense through those years that government was very important work. You know, you were trying to save humanity. Since that's no longer a central dynamic, it has made Washington less important in some ways. And I think that the whole organized attack on government combined with a lot of inefficiencies has combined to make people think that government can't be very efficacious in solving problems. But I do still believe that it is a place where you can do great things. You can certainly do lots of little things. You can influence lives in a way that you can't in other places. But now the really big payoff is when you die. John said, what do you mean? Cokie says, all of a sudden, everybody comes out of the woodwork and says what a great guy he was and all these wonderful things he did and all the ways he brought people together. In the receiving line at my father's memorial service, it was one person after another telling us something he'd done for them. So you can certainly improve individuals' lives from a position in government. John said, watching you do interviews on Nightline, I've noticed that you ask informational questions instead of the gotcha variety. Why? Cokie said, I've always seen my journalistic role as almost a teaching role rather than trying to influence policies. But you can't be naive about it as a reporter because politicians certainly try to use you in every way they can. What I always try to do, for instance, on Brinkley, is think of the question in a way that maybe the person I'm asking hasn't thought of before. So it forces them into a different answer than the set speech they're ready to give. John said, what happens next? Cokie replies, they hesitate. Their eyes blink. The recording doesn't go on. John says, some years ago, I went to the gridiron, which I enjoyed. But for someone not from Washington, it was a bizarre ritual. These two groups, politicians and journalists, socialize with one another, need each other, can't get away from each other, and yet they're pitted into a fundamentally adversarial relationship. Cokie says, it's great, basically. That's the way it always used to be in Washington. Congressmen would pound each other all day and then go out and have a bourbon together. John said, is it genuine, the fellowship, the hail and hearty stuff? Cokie said, it depends. It's genuine with some people and not others. There are people the town loves. Everybody loves Leon Panetta, former chief of staff. Everybody loves Representative Henry Hyde. Everybody loves Bob Dole. John says, why? Cokie says, part of it is just their personalities. A sense of humor goes a long way. Somebody who has some wit and humor and is about to just show it instead of always walking around with porcupine quills sticking out. John said, Bob Dole, by all accounts, is a very funny man. Cokie said, that's what I mean. John said, and yet he didn't seem to come across that way to voters. Cokie said, yes, but the town loved him. The reporters all loved him, and his appearance on David Letterman was classic. That's the Dole we saw for the last umpteen years. John said, why do you think that was lost on the public? Cokie says, I think television hates him. The camera hates him. That's how it is with some people. Richard Nixon, you know, the camera hated him, and Dole comes across like Darth Vader on TV. It's just remarkable. John says, former Washington Post editor Ben Bradley said that the biggest change in Washington is the new primacy of television journalism, that it was hard to be conservative when everyone was only making $18,000 a year. But now journalists make more than the people they are covering, and the Fourth Estate has become a conservative elite. Cokie said, by and large, the whole society has become more conservative. This is not the 30s or the 60s when people arrived in large numbers and were very enthusiastic about government and liberalism. In the 80s, you saw a bunch of conservatives arriving in Washington, including conservative journalists. But the main complaint about the press is not that it's too conservative. John said, perhaps conservative is not the right word. Cokie says, richer. John said, richer, and Cokie says, comfortable. John says, and on a level of influence with those they are covering. That is a relatively new development. Cokie says, well, there were always the Walter Lippmanns of the world, journalists who actually advised presidents and people in office, stuff we would now consider shocking. If anything, knowing that there are going to be millions of people watching does make you more cautious, not just saying the first thing that comes to mind. John says, let me just give you an example. I was watching the Gore-Kemp debate and didn't quite know what to think about it. I was probably just numb. When I saw you do the wrap-up, you said Jack Kemp was incomprehensible. Cokie says, well, Kemp was incomprehensible. Gore was robotic. Medicare, Medicaid, education and the environment, Medicare and Medicaid. Got it? I got it. I also happen to like both of them enormously. John says, but what's the consequence of all that analysis? On election night, it seems anyone who could grip a microphone was on television. Cokie says, well, I think that to some degree it cancels each other out. There are so many voices that people watching just tune out. John says, are people getting more analysis and less objective news? That's what the White House suggests, that journalists have responded to increased competition by personalizing the news and, in the process, making themselves indispensable and bona fide TV personalities. Cokie says, I do think that people are skewing their opinions in order to seem more appealing on the air. And that's a mistake. But I happen to disagree with the White House's argument, because by the time the evening news comes out, the facts have been out there all day long. You know that the TWA flight went down. You know that Al Gore said Medicare, Medicaid, education, and the environment. What you are then trying to do is say, here's what happened, here's why it happened, here's the political situation or the policy situation or the personality situation that made it happen. John says, why not just go for the most provocative statement every time? Cokie says, there are internal checks inside news organizations in terms of what you put on the air and in the nightly news. But if you're alive and talking on the air, there's nobody who could stop you, except yourself. I think the fact that your own reputation is at stake does serve as a very serious check. I can't really speak for other people. All I can say about myself is that, and this may sound self-serving, but it's just the truth, what I have brought to television is who I am, rather than television changing who I am. And when I first started doing this, there wasn't anybody else just talking sort of common sense suburban matron talk. Before, it had been much more of a male club talking about deep policy things without ever saying the emperor has no clothes. John says, Cokie says, like Jack Kemp was incomprehensible. Al Gore was robotic. John says, when you started out as part of a slowly growing group of female reporters, what were the different institutional challenges you faced? Cokie says, my group, people like me and Leslie Stahl, a whole bunch of us about the same age, we all came in at the same time. We were all equally educated as the men who were coming in. We had a very hard time, but we were able to make it better for the people coming after us, and the law changed. Let's not sneeze at that. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 said, in part, that you couldn't discriminate on the basis of sex. Before that, people used to say just straight out, we don't hire women to do that. John says, I can finally ask someone else this. You come from a big Democratic family. Did it affect the kind of access you got? Cokie says, no. I think the main thing politicians care about is the initials after your name, not who you are. If it says NPR and they know that there are 10 million people listening and lots of them are in their district, they'll talk to you. John said, what about your spin on the news? After all, you had two prominent parents in Congress. Cokie said, it was more an advantage than it was a disadvantage. Now, there were times that Democrats thought I should be nicer to them than they thought I was being, Why isn't she in the tank for us? And there were times, I'm sure, when Republicans thought that I was a mouthpiece. And now, John asks, I don't think that it's true at this point for either side, for either party. John says, on the Brinkley Show, more often than not, Sam Donaldson is on the left. George Will is on the right, and you are down the middle. Maybe it's cliche, but as a woman, do you bring a different sensibility to your work, perhaps a less confrontational approach? Cokie says, nobody's faking anything. That's where we come down. Sam's over here, and George is over here, and I'm here. But I do think women are less ideological in general and more commonsensical. They don't care if things don't fit perfectly into some ideological box. And you certainly see that with women politicians. There are Republican women politicians who worked very hard for the Family Leave Act, even though Republican men were against it. And along with the Republicans, Democratic women politicians were some of the real force behind child support enforcement at a time when that was considered very illiberal. So I think that women are much more ready to say, I don't care which party this benefits or which party this is associated with. It does seem to just make sense. Can't we just do it? John says, even now, women make up only 10% of the House and the Senate. Does that perpetuate minority status shape the way female politicians do their jobs? Cokie says, well, I think what happens to a lot of women in office, and I've done a lot of stories about it, is that they become spokeswomen for women as well as their own constituents. My mother certainly was this way. The same thing happens to Hispanics, Asians, and blacks. John says, has there been a sea change in attitudes toward women on the Hill since the Clarence Thomas hearings and the Robert Packwood resignation? Cokie says, no, but I think people are more careful. In the olden days, they would chase you around desks, just grab you on the elevator. I actually don't think the political world is as sensitive to the issue as the corporate world has become. The corporate world understands lawsuits. Look at what's happening in the military with Tailhook and the training program in Aberdeen. Yesterday, a male colleague of mine, who will go nameless, said, well, does this just mean we shouldn't have women in the military? Right, let's blame them for this. John asks Cokie about her show and then ends with this question. What makes a good show or a good guest? Cokie replies, whether the guest is ready to play or not, as we say. If the guest just comes on and spouts the line or has no energy, just the minute he starts talking, you think, oh my gosh, they're turning off sets all over. Can I tickle him? What can I do? We don't script the show at all. We have a conversation ahead of time about what we want to discuss on the roundtable. But we don't know what anybody's going to say until you get on the set. A lot of interesting replies in that interview between John Kennedy and Cokie Roberts, and a lot of interesting numbers as well. The news media has changed a lot since 1997, and it's been very eye-opening to read these articles and compare what we have now for news. Would our country be better off without politicians who vote down party lines? And would our news media be better off without journalists who analyze instead of just share the truth? What do you think? That does it for this episode of the George Collection. Thank you so much for watching. Have a great week, and I will see you next time.
Magazine, George, which is a hoot of a magazine. I thought you were a lawyer.
I was.
What happened?
Well, we decided, actually taking a cue from folks like yourself and you around the 1992 election, that there was an opportunity here to change the definition of a political magazine. Certainly the way Americans were accessing information about politics and politicians was changing. Candidates were appearing on late-night talk shows, on talk radio, on sitcoms, and there was a kind of a leveling process, and while the rest of media clearly had caught up with that, we felt that political magazines per se hadn't.
Your mother was a hell of an editor at Doubleday.
That's what I hear.
Would she have liked George?
I think she would have.